Section 6.1, and Chapter 6 is really all about cost management, service level agreements, making sure you are optimizing your business for the cloud and understanding that the cloud really will have an impact on how you do business along the way. One of the biggest ways that you're going to work in the cloud is trying to make sure that you've got cost management and that you're meeting all your SLAs, right? So the big part of using the Microsoft cloud is that you can improve your performance and your business workloads and your business logic and reduce your costs. Now, remember, we're moving from one bucket to another bucket. We're moving from capital expenses to operational expenses, from CapEx to OpEx. And there's going to be a change in overhead required to manage your organizational assets. And in many cases, your organizational assets may actually go down. You may not need all those extra data centers. You've moved everything into the cloud and are realizing the cost savings there. Right? However, business opportunity creates a risk. And there's always a risk of waste inside the cloud that isn't really something that you would expect to see, but can really happen, especially with how easy it is to spin up a resource, to over provision or not work out capacity planning or not work out scalability and elasticity, to plan for the peak and build for the peak, when really what you need to be doing is planning and building for what your average load is, and then scale out and be elastic for those times when peaks actually happen. It's a very different way of thinking. And that's where planning and managing your costs are super important. So inside of Azure, you have cost management plus billing, and that's a series of tools provided by Microsoft that will help you analyze, manage, optimize, and predict your costs of your workloads. And again, using all of these tools can help you take advantage of all the benefits in the cloud without going a little bit too crazy, right? So a workload is essentially the lights in your home, right? You have your main feed from the street, and your workload is you have lights in the kitchen and in the living room and in the office and in the bathroom. So each one of those workloads is where your lights are, and that's essentially how you want to look at a workload. You can use cost plus management billing and apply that thought process to the workloads used by your organization. There's one cost for my dev test group. There's another cost for my business unit. There's another cost for my business and disaster recovery unit. And again, by using resource management and tagging, you can work out by department and by division, and in some cases by person, who's charging and who's using and who's building and who's designing and developing along the way. Right? So cost plus management features, things that you do need to know about, are conduct billing administrative tasks such as paying your bill. And that's a big one, right? They'll automatically just take it out of your credit card. So make sure your credit card's got the limit for however much you spend on this, or that there's a way to pay it, whether it's a link through the bank or whatever. Manage billing access to costs, download cost and usage data, which is great, because now you can plug it into systems that your finance people already know or your procurement people already know. You can literally integrate this with just about any finance system that you own right now and are working with, and this can really help you manage that whole process. Proactively apply data analysis to your costs. See if your predictive costs are actually in line with your actual costs. And if they're not, figure out where the delta is. Figure out where that difference is between actual spend and estimated spend, and why there's a delta between the two. You can set spending thresholds. And before you set a spending threshold, you should set up a whole series of alerts when you've hit each percentage of your spend. If you have 100% in a 30-day period, so figure 3% per day is your burn. If all of a sudden you have a day where you're spending 4, 5, 6, 10% of your daily expectation, you should be sending an alert to whoever needs to have that to figure out what's going on. Make sure that any anomalies you have are investigated immediately. If someone's trying to spin up something that they shouldn't be, if you're trying to spin up something that's outside the normal capacity for your group, these are all things that you can set alerts for and then tie into your spending thresholds. And then identify opportunities for workload changes that can optimize your spending. This is the best part of the cloud. You can take your business logic from the consumer to the purchase to the fulfillment and actually work out what that workload looks like, what that business logic looks like, and then optimize the entire process all the way through. Think of your supply chain and your management and everything you interact with and get a real feel for what you do as a company, and make sure that it is absolutely optimized for your customers' convenience and to maximize the amount of money you will make off that transaction. And that's a big part of just being in business right now. And the cloud really lets you get there. The thing is, you really need to understand what all your business logic actually looks like. And that can be kind of painful, especially when you're getting started. Azure billing, a great thing to have. It uses to review your invoice costs and manage access to billing information. In larger organizations, you have procurement and finance teams, and they're working together and doing their thing. This can all be automated as a workflow. Right, so a billing account is created when you sign up for Azure. Again, when I did my account, it was really simple. I just did my name, I did my credit card, and boom, I'm in. Other organizations may be a lot bigger than me, which would make sense, and they're going to be working with direct bank transfers and other things, invoices, payments, cost tracking, multiple billing accounts. They're a lot more complex, and Azure can work with all of it. Azure really does tie in nicely with a lot of the finance packages and a lot of the logic that you already have set up for your procurement, finance, and billing teams already. So you can have access through your organization's enterprise agreement and really get a real feel for what you're actually spending. So there's some billing accounts that go in here. Again, I have an individual billing account for Microsoft Online Services, and that's what I did when I signed up. But I can also get other accounts, right? I can get an enterprise agreement. So we can actually go ahead and sign an enterprise agreement, and then there's the consumer agreement, the customer agreement. And that basically your organization works with a Microsoft representative to sign that customer agreement. And again, you can go ahead and select regions, who can sign it, a legal department, pay as you go. There's a lot of other things that go along with the customer agreement and the enterprise agreement. So when you get there, make sure you have your legal team handy. They will want to go through this, but the one thing that you do want to know for your billing accounts is that you have the online services program, individual, enterprise for a company, and then a customer agreement, which is also an organizational level process that you want to take a look at. Cost management. Cost management, again, shows your organizational cost and usage patterns. This has got some good analytics that go behind it and can give you some really fair estimates on where you're going with your cost and with your spend. Now, costs, based on negotiated prices, you can factor in your reservations, hybrid benefit discounts, whether you're committing for a long period, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. Collectively show your internal, external costs for usage and Azure Marketplace charges. And again, that's really neat on your cost management. It really breaks everything down for you. The reports help you understand where your spend and your resource use is and help you find those spending anomalies. And again, I cannot stress enough that you're going to have those spending anomalies and you need to really take a look at them immediately. And that there's also some predictive analytics that are handy to have. It helps you kind of figure out if you're going to hit your budget for the month, if you're going to be over or under, and if you're over, help you figure out what's going on with your management groups, your budget, and then there's recommendations to show how your expenses are organized and how you're going to reduce costs. So again, all this stuff is in there, and it's really good for you to have on that entire cost management platform and on the billing cycle. The thing that you can do as either IT or finance or procurement is help figure out and plan and control expenses. It's the whole team that needs to do this, because you can't just have someone go out and do things because it's like super easy. You need to really have an entire corporate policy and process for how you're going to authorize, spin up, use, tear down, any kind of process within the cloud, right? And cost management can help you do that, especially through cost analysis, budgets, recommendations, and again, exporting that cost management data to your finance officers or to your procurement officers. You can use cost analysis to explore and analyze your organizational costs. And again, you can aggregate those, you can disaggregate them. You can identify spending trends by department, by group, by tag, or by resource, and then kind of see how those accumulated costs over time work into your estimate monthly, quarterly, or even yearly cost trends against whatever budget you set. Now remember, you're reducing CapEx but increasing OpEx. So make sure that you've got your budget set appropriately, otherwise this may be a surprise. Budgets can help you plan for and meet financial accountability in your organization. You don't want to suddenly have a $20,000 daily bill where you were not expecting one. That can really kind of not make your day. So budgets can also help inform others about your spending and proactively manage costs. And again, that's where alerting comes in, and the whole process about who can do what within the cloud is another big important control that you're going to want to pay attention to. Any kind of external access. So you external access to systems to review. And again, the beautiful part about Azure is that it can tie into just about any financial reporting system you've got. You can do a comma separated value format spreadsheet and just drop that into Azure storage and then pick that up programmatically and drop it into your finance. Some finance systems will actually have already APIs and API gateways that you can use, and then you can just access your data however you need to work for your company. There is a way to make that happen in Azure and in the cost management and billing cycle. So there's some additional tools that you'll get involved with here. The Azure pricing calculator. It's a really neat way of estimating your upfront cloud costs, but it can be a little bit more optimistic than you're expecting in terms of the savings. So you really need to take whatever they come with a grain of salt on that one. Not everything is as rosy as you think it's going to be, because we forget about a great majority of the things that we spend money on when we're doing things locally. The cost in your local data center, you don't remember all the things that went into that, from backups to first and second failover network connections and all the other things that suddenly disappear with Azure, and then new things that happen with Azure that go along with the cost functioning. So again, the pricing calculator is pretty good. The total cost of ownership calculator is pretty good as well. Azure Migrate's really kind of neat. It allows you to assess your current data center workload and kind of see if there's actually an Azure replacement solution directly, or if you need to do things to change it, and that will add to your costs. Azure Advisor, this is really good, especially if you've got a heavy dev or production environment where you may have unused systems, and then learn how to turn those off and how to set up reserved instance purchases so you can save money, how to use spot instances, and all the other ways that you can save money underneath Azure Advisor is a good tool to have. And then the Azure Hybrid Benefit, how to use your current on-premises Windows servers or SQL licenses inside of Azure to save money. So that's another big one as well. There's a lot of neat tools that go into this process that you are definitely going to want to know about. You're going to want to know about these four for the test. So in summary, just remember that your cost management and billing is that suite of tools, right? Provided by Microsoft to help you manage, optimize, and analyze the cost of your workloads. And your workloads is your business logic, right? Use the suite is going to help ensure that your organization is taking advantage of the benefits provided by the cloud, and you're saving a little bit of money along the way, and you're realizing all the things that you need to be able to have for cloud computing. And that is it for this lecture. I will see you in the next lecture. 6.2, factors that can affect costs, and there's a lot of them. So just about everything you do on the pay-as-you-go model means that you pay for it. So cost and data usage, and this is the big one, right? And making sure that your cost and usage data, is basically available to you as soon as possible. And that's the big one. This will help you keep track of whatever you are doing and making sure that you are doing your spend correctly. So there's cost management billing in the Azure portal, and this will support data refresh every 8 to 24 hours. So again, remember that there's a delay here, in that as you go through and you start working your actual costs, you may be behind as much as a day in terms of what that cost looks like. So that can be pretty devastating if all of a sudden you get hacked and you open up a Bitcoin mining operation at $20,000 to $30,000 per hour. That's a big chunk of change, and you may be delayed as much as a day behind that. So really do kind of keep an eye on other things that will keep what's going on in your environment there. Especially if some new resource shows up. There's other ways of alerting if someone sets up something that they shouldn't be setting up. So time needed to update the dashboard. And again, remember that as you go through your dashboarding on the factors that can affect your costs, that you do have alerts at other sections. So if someone is spinning up something you don't need them to, or is unusual for your environment or unusual for your business, that you have an alert through a different mechanism other than the cost dashboard, right? The cool part about this update on the dashboard is that estimated charges for a current billing period are updated 6 times a day. So as you kind of go through it, you actually do get 6 times in a 24-hour cycle what your estimated charges are. Estimated charges for the current billing period can change as you incur more usage. So if someone spins up something that they shouldn't be, your high capacity Bitcoin mining operation, and the reason why I keep on using that as my example is because it's happened, is that you can actually run into some real serious costs here. Each update is cumulative, and that means that everything just keeps on updating based on what you've added to it over the last bit. Azure finalizes or closes the current billing period up to 72 hours after the billing period ends. So you won't get a finalized bill until the 3rd if your close date is the last day of the month. And that's another thing to remember too, is that you have that delay between the close and the actual billing period and when that charge shows up on your credit card, right? During the open month uninvoiced period, cost management data should be considered an estimate only. And again, so anytime that you're working during an open period, they're just kind of estimating what you're doing. They're kind of keeping a track on you. But in some cases, charges may be really latent. They maybe arrive well after the usage actually happened. And again, that's where that 72-hour window comes into place. Be really aware of that. And you do have those times that the enterprise agreement subscriptions, the billing ends on March 31st. Estimated charges are updated 72 hours later, in this example by April 4th. So that's the thing to remember. End of month, your charges won't show up until much later. And that's really interesting underneath your enterprise agreement. That's going to be for your pay-as-you-go models and everything else. So if you have a pay-as-you-go subscription, Office 365, billing month ends on May 15th, and the estimated charges get updated on May 19th. So again, just to remember that there's that delay in there. Once cost and usage data becomes available in the cost management plus billing, it's going to be retained for at least 7 years. But that's great because that gives you a real good pattern of data to work on, how much you spend, why you spend that amount of money, and where that spend goes. Some of it may go into your Office 365 subscriptions, and those can be kind of interesting to work with along the way, right? Re-rated data now, sometimes things go wrong. Right? Not everything works the way it works. There may be an Amazon outage in a data center that you work at, and you may actually get some money back, especially if you ask for it. You have to ask to get money back if a data center goes down or a network goes down, something that Azure is responsible for, that blows out your SLA. So cost management APIs, Power BI, Azure portal, expect the current billing period's changes to get re-rated. Changes might not change until the invoice is closed, but the idea being is that your final billing may be a little funky. It may not be exactly what you think it's going to be. It's going to be minor differences, but you can re-rate data. You can get plus and minuses in the column. It just all depends on what the system says, and that 72-hour window can be really mighty inconvenient, especially if you have an immediate billing cycle, or your manager is really fussy about having all of the books closed at the end of the month. So in summary, I think the big thing to remember on things that can affect your costs are knowing that delay times for bill changes, knowing about that 6 times every 24 hours is when your cost estimation builds up. That for some services, a delay of up to 72 hours, especially for end of month services, or especially on the pay-as-you-go model. Know that some services are going to be re-rated and charges might not show up right away, so you get plus and minus in the column. All that stuff may show up a month later, right? And understand that that's just a thing that's going to happen. It's not anything you can do. Things that can also impact costs are just not tracking costs right? And making sure that you're not cost optimized for the cloud. So make sure that when you get your cost changes and things that can affect your costs, that you really do have a really good handle on it. And again, this is where resource management, tagging, working with your PMO office, and a lot of other things come into play to help you get there. But for this test, just know that there's bill delays and know that some charges will be re-rated. Thank you, and I will see you in the next lecture. 6.3, factors that can reduce your Azure costs. So we've always talked about how things work in terms of how things can be expensive or less expensive. And as you go through this section, you learn a lot about how to save money, how to watch what you cost and what your burn rate is, and everything else. The big thing about reducing costs is just keeping an eye on it. Right? So use some cost analysis, use some budgeting and planning tools. Make sure that when you use the cost analysis tool, that you are really taking a look at your in-depth costs per section and slicing and dicing, right? Again, the important part here is making sure that you're provisioned correctly and that you have really optimized your costs to get the best deal out of the cloud. So there's a lot of common questions when you go through this, and the questions on a regular basis. I hope you stay more informed and more cost conscious about your decisions. And these are questions like, what are my estimated costs for the current month? Right? How much have I incurred so far this month, and will I stay under my budget? This is a big one, that cost viewpoint into what your monthly budget is. Now remember, billing is different than costs. So for your estimated cost and what's going on here, in terms of, did someone spin up something they shouldn't have spun up? Did something happen that I don't know about? What's this $20,000 charge for a high capacity system? What are my developers doing? Go in there and immediately investigate any anomalies, right? And do routine checks. Make sure that tagging is right. Make sure that your standardization is correct. Make sure that you have a range of normal usage, right? Or if there's a project going on and there's a lot of development, a lot of test, make sure that you're working with your PMO office. What are trends? Are there any outliers? Just really make sure that you are really got your hand on the pulse of what's going on with your operational expenses along the board. And it may require that you work with your program management office, and it may require that your finance and program management office work really closely with each other and have an immediate remediation plan in process for something that is an anomaly. Invoice reconciliation, make sure that your latest invoice costs are pretty much so in line with what your spending habits are. And again, billing's a little bit different, but make sure that you really do check your billing and make sure that you are doing things the way that you normally do. And if there's an anomaly, go back and take a look at it. And also make sure that you've got internal chargebacks and how much you're being charged, how should those charges be broken down from our organization, and then who's actually footing the costs for those specific items. Your PMO or your test group may not have thought about how much that dev environment actually costs, especially if they're working at trying to figure out what peak looks like. That can be pretty pricey really, really quickly. And you may need to be able to go back to that organization or that group or that business unit and go, hey, we overran because of you and I need you to pay me back. Right? And I really do need to make sure that those charges are broken down for my organization by tags and by resource groups and by all the other things that I can do to make sure that I'm billing and charging these things correctly. Right? Export your bill. I like this one because you can export your bill to just about any kind of external system or dashboard or financial system out there. You can set up automated exports to Azure storage, so you can just avoid any kind of manual download. You can actually have a heads up display, a daily report that goes through and says, here's where my spend at, here's what my projections are looking like. You can set up alerts to notify you if all of a sudden you're doing a big spend. If you are on a 30-day billing cycle and all of a sudden you go 3% over your standard daily amount, have an alert. You can set up all these automatic integrations to keep your billing systems and your billing data in sync, and that can really help you keep a handle on what's going on every day with your costs. And then alerts. I love alerts. Alerts are the best thing that you can do. Once you've got a spending pattern figured out, it's important that you set up your limits for yourself and your teams. Make sure that if something weird happens, that you are alerted the immediate amount of time. If someone is out of range and tries to set up a high capacity computing cluster and you don't have any reason for a high capacity computing cluster, make sure you get an alert. Make sure if someone's looking like they're going to overrun their budget based on projections, and you can set this up as a daily announcement to make sure that you're getting that alert. Oh, hey, we're over budget. Oh, hey, we might go over budget. There's other problems to go along. Make sure you're reviewing your budgets internally with what your actual spend is, so you get a really nice map. You can actually use that data for some machine learning and go through and make some really nice modeling on how does your cloud computing actually work and turn that into a beautiful dashboard for your finance officer. And there's a lot of other things you can do with Azure budgets that you can do to set up your alerts, budget thresholds, automation triggers, configure your service to shut down VMs if you're going way over. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do here that would be really, really weird to your operational, your ops department, is if finance starts shutting down things that can really scare them. So make sure that when you're going through this and talking about what these things will trigger, what will end up actually happening along the way. But just make sure that you're working in conjunction with your finance, your operations budget, and everything else that goes along with that when you're setting up alerts and actions to those alerts, like making sure that your dev environment is shut down every night. There's no reason to have it on overnight. So in summary, it's really easy to overrun your budget. It really is. You spin up something that looks really, really cool. You plan on peak capacity instead of working on scalability. You do a lot of other things in test and dev environments that you probably don't need to do. You set up systems that are too big for the product that you want to test, or you're just not following good cloud computing programming things. You're spinning up VMs for functions instead of doing Lambda or serverless environment or whatever along the way. So make your budget, set your alerts, and know what your daily spend looks like, and know that there's going to be some delays in the data that comes along, as much as 72 hours. That will influence how your budget estimates and alerts work. But really, there's ways of managing and maintaining this and making ways of reducing costs. And most of them is just simple awareness, setting some automation around it, and then keeping tabs on what your actual spend is. So that's it for how to reduce costs in Azure. And I will see you in the next lecture. 6.4, total cost of ownership. And this is kind of a smaller section in terms of the data that you need to know about how to work total cost of ownership. And the big part about this whole process is understanding how the total cost of ownership calculator works and how you can estimate your cost savings of operating your solution on Azure over time all right, instead of on your on-premise data center. So the big idea here behind using the TCO calculator is that you're going to kind of help figure out how you move from OpEx and CapEx, how you get all that stuff together. The thing you really want to make sure of when you're using the total cost of ownership calculator is what's optimistic about it. Where are you going wrong with that calculation? If you're saying that I need X provision just like my data center, well, how much of your data center are you actually using? And that's where we need to kind of understand what total cost of ownership means. And again, this is a finance phrase. It's not something that we use a lot in IT, and it can be hard to see all the hidden costs related to operating and technology. Right? You've got software licenses, you've got electricity, you've got heating, you've got cooling, you've got people, you've got how much the racks cost, how much the servers cost, how much the configuration for that server costs, any kind of fire suppression system, any kind of backup generators or any other things like that, how much the internet costs, what is your primary internet connector and what is your backup internet connector. All those things go into that total cost of ownership if you're in a data center or if you're in the cloud. But the one thing that really differs on that total cost of ownership is how do you scale? And that's something that's really the hard part. Your data center is a fixed object with a fixed capacity. The cloud allows you to scale almost infinitely based on customer demand. So you may have a running operation that's actually fairly easygoing. You've just had to provision a data center for your peaks. So you may only need 100 kilobits of data every second or 100 megabits of data every second, but your peak is in the gig range. So you built your data center around that gig range. You can actually then take in your total cost of ownership, what am I normal operating, and then how do I scale out for those peaks that I need to have. So in using the calculator, you can enter the details of your on-premise workload because you've built that for your peak scale. Your cloud costs are going to be cheaper than that because you're going to be working at your normal scale. And that's where you need to know where your normal is for your particular app and how much you're actually running in your data center. So if your data center on normal is only using 40% of its capacity because that's the normal load, then there's where you're going to want to start plugging in your calculator. If you only peak on maybe 3 months out of the year, then that would be your other calculations that you need to worry about when you're doing this. And you really do want to plug in everything, right? You want to plug in your electricity, network, maintenance, labor, any other things going along inside of how you manage your thing, your data center, including the backup generators and your fire suppression and certification costs, audit costs. And there's just a boatload of things that go into total cost of ownership. And then side by side those, compare those costs of running the same workloads on Azure. Don't be worried if it's too optimistic, right? That's going to be a big thing because odds are highly likely the first time someone uses this is you're looking at your total data center and you're looking at the idea that your data center was built around peak capacity rather than your average capacity. So some of those costs can be really radically different and really wildly optimistic on the amount of savings that you'll make. So you really do want to try to run what is your average data center load and then how many times do you need to be at peak every year. So the big thing on this one, the big summary, is that the total cost of ownership calculator is a great tool for estimating your total cost for moving or using services in the cloud. And you can go and access this calculator anytime that you want to. But just be really aware that it can be really optimistic and that when you're running your first initial costs, that you may actually be looking at your total data center and that your total data center was built around peak capacity. Look at your normal data center usage and then figure out how many times a year you need all that peak capacity. And that will make it a lot more realistic when you're using that total cost of ownership calculator. And really honestly think about everything from the rack to the wire to the people to the software to the licenses. Everything needs to be included in that to be really realistic. And that's it for this lecture. The total cost of ownership calculators, again, a really, really easy tool to use, really straightforward. And I will see you in the next lecture. Quick run through of the total cost of ownership calculator and how it works at Azure. So essentially what you're doing here is you're going to be defining all your workloads, and you really do want to add different things to it and how many servers you've got and other things that you may have along the way. You may have additional workloads, you may not have additional workloads, but you can go ahead and you can trash those if you want. And you can figure out what you want to do. If you do want to trash something out, you just want to do something new, clear it out, you can just go ahead and do it one by one piece. You can go ahead and figure out your databases and how much your databases are going to cost. And you can go ahead and clear out anything that's in there as well and just add a regular old database, any kind of storage that you may need. You can just go ahead and add storage and it will give you, what you've got for local disk, any kind of networking that you need to have. And then you can go ahead and adjust any kind of assumption that you've got, anything else. All these costs that go into electricity and storage costs and other things are pretty much so just what the national standard is. Your costs may vary by where you're at. Your wattage may be different depending on what kind of hardware that you actually have. Your database costs and networking costs and other things may be different. So if you are just working with a regular thing, you have this really optimistic pricing model. And for that one computer over 5 years, you can save 90 grand. And that's kind of the interesting thing on this one, is that did we really take in the whole thing on that whole process? Is this really true? And you're really going to want to go back and manage a lot of this stuff as it kind of goes through, and make sure that those services are actually available to you as you go through this. And again, they kind of do give you some real good costs in here to work them out, and you can actually plug ahead and go with these along the way. But you can actually check out and see what your compute costs are going to look like. And again, these are pretty small servers, so they're not really going to be super expensive. Over 5 years, does your server cost you less than $1,200 to run? And that's really what you're looking for in terms of, can you do this for cheaper? Probably not. Your total hardware cost, can you do per server of $46.92? And is that where you're going to get where your money is? And do you really get this much on electricity? And SQL databases are going to be your big one, right? That's really where you're going to get your savings, and other processes. And again, it's just kind of a neat way of taking a look at it. And you can just go ahead and download that if you want to download it, in terms of how this works. But again, flipping through this is actually really kind of fun to take a look at it and how much you can actually save, based on what you've got. Some services are not going to be available in all locations, so it can be kind of hard to run this, because it will just error out and say that service isn't available and it won't tell you which one. So that is a downside to the total cost of ownership calculator, but it is a neat way of taking a look at how your whole process will work in terms of trying to figure out whether you can actually save money with Azure. Odds are highly likely that you can, but just be really aware when you're doing this what all those costs are. So again, this was just that quick hands-on demo through the total cost of ownership calculator. Thank you, and I will see you in the next lecture. 6.5, cost management. So one of the biggest influencers on whether we go into the cloud is how much are things going to cost. And there's a real big difference between billing and cost management. And people obviously need to know the difference on this, is they're calling this out specifically in the syllabus. So although related, billing differs from cost management. That's the first line, is that you have two different portions of this. Billing is what you charge. Cost management is how you keep your bill down. So billing is part of the process of just, here's how you pay for your stuff in Azure. So Azure cost management really will show you the organizational cost and usage patterns with advanced analytics. So cost management is really more about making sure that the services you use in the cloud are services that you are actually using and using to their fullest capacity, right? So if you spin up, or your developers spin up a development environment, that environment's turned off at the end of the day and not just left running willy-nilly, right? If you are running a specific service and it's running open and there's no end to this, or it's consuming too many cycles, then that's another thing you need to know about. And that's where cost management comes in. You want to make sure that your organizational cost and usage patterns make sense for what you're trying to do in the cloud, right? So you get a lot of really neat reports. There's some really cool advanced analytics that go along with this. But in a lot of ways too, your costs are based on your negotiated prices. So you may have reservations, you may have dedicated hosts, you may have hybrid benefit discounts, you may have a lot of other things that influence your cost management that will be reflected in your monthly bill, right? So Azure cost management. Collectively, reports show your internal and external costs for usage in the Azure Marketplace charges, right? So basically, your report's going to show you what you've spent and how much you've purchased. The support and taxes and other things aren't yet shown in the report, so your monthly billing may be subject to change, right? So know that there may be other things tacked on at the end of the month that aren't going to show up in your cost management reports. So the cost management reports will help you understand your spending and resource use and help you find if there's an anomaly. So if all of a sudden your costs boom out by $20,000 a day because someone is doing some Bitcoin mining, this will show up in your report. And you can also do some predictive analytics to make sure that one department isn't suddenly burning money that they shouldn't be, or that something is going on that shouldn't be going on, such as Bitcoin mining, or someone's broken into your account and is doing something funky with it. Cost management can use Azure management groups and budgets and recommendations to show you how your expenses are organized, and can give you some predictive analytics on how you might reduce your costs, right? If you've overcapacitated for a specific thing and you're spending money on a service that you don't need to be spending that much money on a service, it can recommend that you go to an auto scale or a more elastic approach where you're only paying for that service at that level when it spikes, and the rest of the time it's pretty much so a lot lower in terms of what you need to do. And the other thing you need to understand too is that the data is portable. So if you have a cost management dashboard and you're working with that, you can actually export that data into other systems. So automated billing and data export and schedule reports are also available. And that may make it easier for your finance folks or your operational expenditure folks or whoever is managing that section of the budget. You can actually export this out into most of the systems that most people will use nowadays who are running finance or managing the spend. You can also set up automated alerts and a bunch of other neat things about running into cost management, so that if something weird is going on, you can find out relatively quickly about it. So in summary on this section, cost management is basically that part where we look at your usage and your usage patterns. We take some look at it with some advanced analytics, and then we figure out ways that we can help you save money, either through AI or usage-based costs, or over provisioning and then not having an elastic solution to it. There are lots of different ways that you can do cost management, and this whole process of cost management within Azure can really help you understand where your spend is going, and understand that it is different than billing. Billing is a little bit different than this. Billing is what you've actually spent, but cost management will help you understand where you're spending the money and why it's going to where it's going to go. So that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in the next lecture. Quick section 6.6. So 6.6 is about SLAs. And again, SLAs, there's just a boatload of tabular data. This is a section that gets repeated an awful lot, but it's really important for you to understand about your service level agreements and what they do. So as Azure undergoes changes and improvements, there's going to be changes and additions to the SLAs and the things that they will allow you to do and the things that they're responsible for, and so on. Again, you can use the Azure preview features, whether that's public or private, depending on if you get invited. You can do all the beta test, pre-release versions of products, and odds are highly likely they won't have an SLA, right? They're in test, they're in development, they're not generally available. Once they become generally available, then you'll get an idea of what the SLAs are. And as part of the beta testing process, you get to provide feedback, improve Azure, and all the rest of it. So it's really kind of neat. But if you're using a beta or you're using a public preview or private preview, it's not anything that you're going to get an SLA around. So you really do need to remember that of the previews, there are public and private, and those are really kind of interesting, and the little demon faces for real, right? Again, it's the idea. You can use them, but there's something you need to know about those before they do. Again, no SLAs. Subject to change, subject to being turned off immediately, whatever the issue is. The private preview is only available for certain Azure customers for the evaluation process. That's either because you asked for that, or they think that you can provide them valuable feedback for that, and they will expect you to do that. The public preview is available for all Azure customers. They probably worked out the big major core issues. They've got some pretty good functionality going, but don't risk your business using it. It's not meant to be used for consumer-facing stuff. It's just kind of, here, see if you can make it work for your company, right? So you can access previews at the specific URL, azuremicrosoft.com, update status in preview. The web page will list all of the Azure features that are currently in preview and available for evaluation. So that's just their public previews. Right? The features are listed in chronological order, so basically newest on top, oldest on bottom. So again, some of these just won't make it. They won't become something that you want to use. They may be neat, it may be something you want to emulate, but public may not make it to general availability. So again, click on the link for the feature to learn more about the feature and how to use it. So there's some limited documentation, but there's a lot of things you're going to have to figure out. And then preview features that are specific to the Azure portal can be found by going to the portal preview page. So there's a difference between portal previews and then just the general previews that everyone can get access to. So your subscriptions, you can also subscribe to receive notifications whenever new Azure features become available by just subscribing to updates, or you can use an RSS feed for people that actually still use RSS feeds to update the Azure web page, and you can receive these notifications through a feed reader if you actually use one. I haven't seen news feeds, RSS feeds used in years. Kind of interesting. And then general availability. This is stuff you can use. You can use this every day. It is evaluated, tested, will be released, has an SLA, has guarantees for uptime, easily documented, has a lot of support for it. And basically, general availability is what you would expect from a Microsoft product that's now ready for the market. So general availability becomes the next phase in the Azure product lifecycle after the private and public preview phase, and then you get to use the toy. And you can use it for your business. It's worth using for whatever reason. All right, so that's basically the summary. That basically there are two types of previews, public and private. Private, just for people that either requested it or are basically is someone that's working with Microsoft to test their code. And then public, limited availability. Public people can use it, but don't risk your company on it. It has no SLAs, odds are highly likely, minimal documentation. And then when you really want to do a thing, wait for it to be in general availability if you really want it for your company. So per product SLA can be found here. And again, it's really kind of interesting. There's a whole section on this coming up, and it is just crazy. It is a huge, huge, huge table of data. And that table of data is just something to remember as much as you can. Mostly just the numbers, 99.5 through 99.9, right? And we'll go into that when you get into the other section. But that's it for SLAs and public and private previews. It's really kind of an interesting process that Microsoft uses to test their software, and it's really nice that they involve the public. But again, just kind of remember, if it's private or public preview, don't risk your company on it. It's kind of neat to play around with if you want to, and you're really not all that mature in how you do software coding. Wait for general availability. Much easier with a good SLA and with good documentation. And there's a number of actions that can happen that can impact an SLA. So in this section, we've been talking about SLAs an awful lot and what they do and what they don't do. And one of the big things to really understand is what is an uptime. So uptime is the amount of time that a service is available. That's the amount of time it can go and do work for you or process or whatever it is it's doing. And when you go to the Microsoft website, you're just going to see this absolute plethora of tabular data. But the big core here is that you're going to see varying uptimes from anywhere from 99.95 to 99.99%. And a lot of that is depending on the architecture and the system that you're working with. So a lot of this relies on you and how you built it and what Microsoft actually offers in terms of a service, depending on what your architecture is. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But there are distinct actions that both you or the service provider can take that will drive the ability to actually meet out on what the service level is and how that will impact what you're doing. So an SLA is pretty straightforward. This is one straight from the tabular data. So the SLA is we guarantee that each application gateway cloud service having 2 or more medium or larger instances or deployments capable of supporting auto scale or zone redundancy will be available at least 99.95% of the time. And, that sounds pretty good, but there's a way to read this and kind of understand how that works and the process. So we guarantee that each thing meeting these conditions that has failover setup will be available at least 99.95% of the time. So if you're using Application Gateway and you have an architecture that has 2 or more medium, larger VM instances running all the time, and you have set up auto scaling for your application or multi-zone for failover or disaster recovery, then as your only promises, your application will be available 99.95% of the time, or down per year, 4.38 hours, or about 22 minutes rounded up per month. It's like really super close to 22 minutes. And that's how you read it. And if you want or can't manage to have downtime of 22 minutes per month, then you're going to want to architect around that. And that's the big thing with these SLAs and your architect and your developers is understand that this is the guarantee but this is what it means. And you have to meet certain criteria for them to actually meet this SLA. If you don't meet this very specific set of requirements, they're not going to give you any guarantees of service, right? Because this is how it works. So your architecture really matters here when you're working with your SLAs and you're working with the whole process along the way, right? So every line in the tabular data gives you a different standard for what they'll meet by a different system, right? So you're not going to be able to renegotiate this. Azure is just going to say, hey, this is take it or leave it. This is what it is. So you need to incorporate those SLA times into your operational process. And you, when you go through and do your service agreements and you do all the processes that you need to do for your company, you need to go back and make sure that, hey, is 22 minutes per month doable? Right? What happens if we're down for 22 minutes per month? What's the cost of that outage? And then do I really want to turn around and do something about that? So, if you're Amazon, 22 minutes is probably, a couple $100 million. If you're me, 22 minutes is like, nothing, right? But if it's 22 minutes on Udemy, if it's 22 minutes on Canvas, if it's 22 minutes for your company, what does that actually look like? Right. And then how do you architect around that? So generally, you're going to fail over to a different zone. You're going to do database promotion. You're going to do read replicas. You're just going to do all these things to minimize that thing down. You're going to have a much more scalable and a much more interesting architecture, understanding what those 22 minutes per month can actually cost you in terms of your company. So SLA times will vary a lot depending on what that configuration looks like. And again, back to your architecture. So just for one, right, we'll just pull one out of the hat here for the Azure database for Postgres SQL. So these are all in line. These are what they will guarantee. And notice that based on the configuration, they give you a different SLA guarantee depending on how you set it up. So that guarantee of 99.99% only happens, right, if you will have connectivity between their Microsoft database single server and our internet gateway. They're only guaranteeing connectivity from the database to the gateway for that. So there's one, right? We guarantee at least 99.95 of the time customers will have connectivity to their Microsoft Azure database if you're using hyperscale, Citrus, high availability nodes. So there you go. We guarantee at least 99.99 of the time customers will have connectivity to their Microsoft Azure database, flexible server configuration with zone redundant high availability, or flexible server configured without zone redundant high availability. So again, that's kind of where you need to pull this out and take a look at it. Depending on your architecture, these are the things that will impact your SLAs. So in summary, you know how to read an SLA, so you know how to manage downtime via architecture, right? And that's the big one here, is understand what your downtime costs you, and how do you fix that via architecture? How do you fix that via disaster recovery, business continuity, whatever mechanism you need to inside your company to take a look at that. Know that your SLA times will definitely vary on the architecture that you choose, right? And that you don't need to memorize the whole set of tabular data. It is just a mess of data that you get. Just know that the SLA percentages vary from 99.95 to 99.99%, and it's going to totally depend on the service, the way it's architected, and what they're actually promising you. So when you go through and you do these audits or you do your process, just really read these things carefully and just be really aware in the real world outside of the test that your architecture can really influence what your SLA times are and what can impact that SLA along the way. So that's it for this lecture. I will see you in the next lecture. The final section of all the study notes. Section 6.8, we're going to talk about the service lifecycle. So one of the things that you really do need to stay up on top of is that there's a very big difference between what the public preview versus general availability, GA, means, right? So the public preview during this phase, people can go ahead and use the service and evaluate it, but now, they may not give you a normal service level agreement. They may not fully support it. You're basically beta testing it for them. Once it's been made generally available, though, and everything's ready, it's passed all of its checks, it's useful, people are using it, you are now using it on a regular basis, which means you now are going to be doing mandatory updates to that specific feature, whatever that feature is. These updates are going to give you early access to features as well as current available features that are included in the release. But the big thing is that once you are into general availability, It can be used by anybody, and normal service level agreements apply. But there's some very specific steps that your service will go through to get started. So every service starts in the development phase. The Azure team collects and defines the requirements, and then we'll build the service. Doesn't matter what it is, it's just how they go about doing it. Someone says, hey, wouldn't it be nice if, and then they decide that that's what they really want to do. Once that service has been kind of put together and they're into beta or alpha testing, you can get into the public preview phase, or you can get into a private preview phase. Right, so if you're private, you may be the one that asked for the service and they're going to have you test it out for them. Public preview phase is the next step out from that, and that public can access and experiment with it and provide feedback. So again, you're beta testing for Microsoft in the public preview. Once it's been all validated and tested and everyone's happy and they've worked out as many bugs as possible, it goes into general availability, which means anyone can use it at any time. Right? So there's some really specific facts on the steps here that you need to be really aware of. Right? Each Azure preview defines its own terms and conditions. So there's a difference between private preview, public preview, and general availability in terms of what Microsoft will actually support. Previews are excluded from service level agreements. You may not get a service level agreement. They may turn it off in the middle of testing. They may decide not to go forward with it, or they may make some back-end change that will break your code. So just be really aware that if you are in a preview, don't be using this for production. All preview specific terms and conditions, are basically a supplement to your existing service agreement. In other words, if you make a change or something changes, Azure will go, hey, but this is in preview. Some previews aren't covered by customer support, so if something breaks or something's not working right, you can't call up the help desk and go, what's wrong? So you need to be really aware of those things that you're working with that do have customer support and those that don't. And again, even Azure, Microsoft recommends that you do not use any kind of preview for business critical workloads. Because again, subject to change without notice, don't have an SLA, have their own terms and conditions, and some of them don't even have consumer support. They're going to be more fun to play around with and see if there's something you can do with them for your business logic. So Azure follows what's called a modern lifecycle policy, and this is the one thing that you do really want to really pay attention to, right? It covers products and services that are serviced and supported continuously. So part of your CI/CD deck, right? Your continuous integration, continuous development deck. Under this policy, the product or service remains in support if the following criteria are met. Customers must stay current. In other words, if they change something, you need to follow along with those changes. And you need to make sure that your system requirements are published for the product and service and you're following them. Your customer must be licensed to use the product or service. In other words, it has to be in general availability and generally supported, and that Microsoft must currently offer support for the product or service. So a lot of this stuff is going to rely on how you program now for your company. Your entire standard for this process is going to change. So change notification, this is the hardest part, is finding out when something changes. And I don't know why it is as hard as it is, but it really is. You have to, as a product manager or as a product usage person, need to really stay up on top of what's coming. Now, Microsoft does alert for forthcoming modifications of their product or service. You just have to be really ready to go. And you have to be really ready to work within that minimum 30 days notification, right? In order to make sure that you're changing your code so that you can continue using that product or service. And that's the big thing, right? Make sure that your development lifecycle internal to your company can work within that 30-day notification stream and take action. Make sure that your program and your coders can work within that time frame using whatever service you use, whether that's Agile, Scrum, Kanban boards, whatever. The earlier you get that notification, the longer you can take to make the change. But some of these notifications, you may not see that 30-day notice, and you may all of a sudden just change on you. So that's the one thing to be really aware of. Have a team ready to go on a moment's notice. So continuity migration. Now, this is interesting because for products governed by the modern lifecycle policy, Microsoft will provide a minimum 12 months notification prior to ending support if no successor product or service is offered. And they're really good about this. You can find this on their website. It's relatively easy to go. So just make sure that you are really latched into the Microsoft alerting service. Now, of course, if it's a free service or a preview release, they may just kill it and they don't care. So not a big deal, but if you are really dependent on something, they should give you a year's notification for any support or no success or product. And that means you have to revise all your code, especially if it's a big dependency. For products under the existing lifecycle policy, Microsoft will continue to provide servicing and support for a fixed amount of time. And we see that with Microsoft. It's really common that they'll give operating systems a certain amount of time before they turn it off, and it's usually a really long time. So anything that's already launched with existing lifecycle policies are going to continue being supported, but then you are going to get to end of support dates. And if you've waited till the end of support date to reprogram your code, that's a problem in-house that you really are going to want to address and deal with along the way in terms of how you're going to do continuity, migration, your continuous integration, and continuous development. How you go cloud native matters here. So you've got to build this into CI/CD, your continuous integration, continuous development. And the big takeaway is that this is really a big influencer of how your company works on CI/CD. Right? Once you get the notification of the change, you need to be able to go back and be able to review that change and make sure that change can be adopted. Now, this might require just a small change to code. It might require a complete refactor or a complete redesign of the business logic to still provide the support you need for your company. Now, changes to products are going to happen all the time. The hard part is keeping up with them, and the hard part is getting those notifications from Microsoft early enough that it's not crisis management. So you really do want to build into those things that work on your system's life cycle. Make sure that notification is a big part of that, and make sure that however you do it is independent of specific people, that there's an automated process to notify you, whether that's a mailing list to a group box or whether that's something else. Just make sure that you're on top of them so you have the time to have a leisurely and orderly way of changing your code. So in summary, each Azure preview defines its own terms and conditions. Some of them will have terms and conditions, some of them will have support, some of them won't. Previews are always excluded from the service level agreements. So you need to be really aware of that. If you're playing around with previews, whether they're private or public, there's really no SLA on those. You're kind of as is, at will, however you want to phrase it. Customers must stay current, and this is the hard part, per the servicing and system requirements. And this is a complete change on how companies do software. Generally, you write it once and you forget about it until somebody needs an update or until a project comes through. This requires a different way of managing code internal for your custom code. So you really need to stay current. Customers must be licensed to use the product or service in those places where you need to be. And then Microsoft must currently offer support for the product or service. If Microsoft is at end of life style or end of life for those, don't worry about it. You're going to have to find some other way of satisfying your business logic. And that's the big one on the SLAs and how those work and how they work in terms of the system lifestyle and the service lifestyle. And there it is. That's the whole story, and this is the end of the lecture series. So I'm hoping that you guys are getting ready to take the test next, and I'll talk about my experience with the test here in just a moment. Thank you much. See you when I'm talking about my test experience.